You are evicted, Mr. Miller. Effective immediately. Brenda Thorne's voice, sharp as a freshly sharpened pencil, sliced through the crisp lakeside air. She stood on my weathered wooden porch, a meticulously ironed floral blouse straining across her chest, a clipboard clutched like a weapon. Behind her, the placid surface of Whispering Pines Lake shimmered under the afternoon sun, reflecting her triumphant, almost gleeful smirk. Your continuous, flagrant violations of the Homeowners Association bylaws have left us no choice. This cabin, this entire eyesore of a property, is no longer welcome in our community. My gaze drifted past Brenda, past the pristine, manicured lawns of her own sprawling property just a stone's throw away, past the shimmering expanse of the lake, all the way to the distant, tree-lined shore. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. Evicted, Brenda? I repeated, my voice calm, almost amused. That's quite the claim. I took a deliberate step back, gesturing broadly with one hand, encompassing not just my little cabin, but the vast, sparkling water stretching out before us, and even a sliver of the land Brenda stood so proudly upon. Considering, I continued, my voice dropping just a fraction, that you're standing on my land, looking at my lake, I'd say that's going to be a bit of a challenge. Brenda's confident smirk wavered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then outrage. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes, usually narrowed in judgment, widened just a fraction. The clipboard seemed to slip in her grasp. The serene beauty of the lake, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves, and the distant call of a loon seemed to underscore the sudden, pregnant silence between us. She stammered, words catching in her throat, utterly unprepared for the quiet bomb I had just dropped. She thought she was holding all the cards, but she hadn't even realized she was playing a different game entirely. And the game she was playing? It was on my board. How could this be? How could I own the lake? How could I own her backyard? The question hung heavy in the air, a phantom bell tolling an unheard truth. Life in the city, for Daniel Miller, had always been a symphony of urgency. Honking taxis, the relentless hum of distant traffic, the constant chatter of countless lives pressed too close together, it was a daily concerto of chaos. Daniel, a man in his late 20s, worked as a freelance web designer, a job that allowed him to be anywhere with a decent internet connection. But lately, anywhere had started to feel like nowhere, just a blur of concrete and hurried footsteps. He longed for quiet, for the rustle of real leaves instead of office air conditioning, for the sight of open water instead of endless skyscraper reflections. He craved simplicity, a place where the biggest decision of the day might be whether to fish or read. The dream of a cabin by a lake wasn't a sudden whim, it had been a quiet hum beneath the surface of his urban life for years. He'd spent countless evenings scrolling through real estate listings, poring over maps, imagining a life where the rhythm of the seasons dictated his days, not the artificial buzz of a city grid. He wanted to wake up to birdsong, not sirens. He wanted to breathe air that smelled of pine and damp earth, not exhaust fumes. He wanted to feel connected to something larger than himself, something ancient and unyielding, like a vast body of water. One rainy Saturday, buried under a pile of coding manuals and a half-eaten pizza, Daniel stumbled upon it. A listing for a small, unassuming cabin nestled on the shores of Whispering Pines Lake. The photos were grainy, the description brief: rustic lakeside dwelling. Needs TLC. Unique opportunity. It didn't look like much, honestly. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged slightly, and the yard was a tangle of overgrown bushes. But there was a certain charm to it, a wild, untamed beauty that spoke to something deep within Daniel's soul. The lake itself, even in the blurry photos, looked vast and inviting, shrouded in a gentle mist that hinted at untold stories. The price, surprisingly, was within his reach, especially for a lakeside property. It felt less like a transaction and more like a calling. He booked a viewing immediately. The drive out of the city was a journey into another world. The skyscrapers slowly gave way to rolling hills, then dense forests, until finally, a narrow, winding road led him deep into a secluded area. When he finally saw the cabin in person, his heart did a little leap. It was even more charmingly dilapidated than the pictures suggested. But the location. It was perfect. The cabin sat right on the water's edge, with its own small, rickety dock stretching out into the clear, cool lake. The air smelled crisp and clean, a world away from the city's exhaust. The real estate agent, a jovial woman named Susan, met him there. "It's a bit of a project, Daniel," she'd warned, pushing a stray strand of hair from her eyes. "But the bones are good, and the land is special." She led him around the property, pointing out the ancient oak trees, the surprisingly vibrant patches of wildflowers, and the natural spring bubbling up near the back. The previous owner, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, she lived here for 80 years, Susan explained, her voice softening. She was a fascinating woman. Said this land had been in her family for generations, since before the Revolution even. The deeds are unique. Very old. You'll see when we get to the paperwork. She chuckled lightly. She was very particular about who bought it. Wanted someone who would appreciate its history, not just tear it down for a modern box. Daniel walked through the cabin, imagining the life that had unfolded within its walls. He ran his hand over the rough-hewn beams, felt the coolness of the stone fireplace. He pictured himself here, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise over the lake, or writing code by the warmth of a crackling fire on a cold winter night. It felt right. More than right, it felt like coming home. The paperwork, as Susan had warned, was indeed unique. Not just a stack of modern forms, but ancient, brittle documents filled with elegant, faded script. They spoke of riparian rights extending to the deepest channel, of easements granted in perpetuity across ancestral pathways, and of uninterrupted dominion over the waters adjacent. Daniel, eager to seal the deal, skimmed over the more archaic legal jargon, trusting his lawyer to handle the specifics. He knew he was buying the cabin and the land it sat on, along with lake access. He signed the papers with a flourish, a sense of profound peace settling over him. He was officially a lake owner, or so he thought. What he didn't fully grasp was the sheer, breathtaking extent of what he had just acquired. Mrs. Vance, a twinkle in her eye during their brief meeting, had simply smiled and said, "Take care of it, dear. It's more than just a house, it's a legacy." The first few months were a blur of sawdust, paint fumes, and contented exhaustion. Daniel threw himself into renovating the cabin, lovingly restoring its original character while adding modern comforts. He patched the roof, sanded and refinished the floors, and painted the walls in calming, earthy tones. He built new bookshelves, installed a cozy wood stove, and cleared away years of overgrowth to reveal a small, charming garden. He wasn't just fixing a house, he was nurturing a dream. He reveled in the quiet, the solitude. His work productivity soared, fueled by the fresh air and the absence of urban distractions. He learned to fish, to identify the local birds by their calls, and to simply sit by the lake, watching the light change on the water. It was everything he had hoped for and more. His introduction to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, however, was less serene. It arrived in the form of a perfectly typed, official-looking letter, tucked neatly into his mailbox. The letter, signed by Brenda Thorne, the HOA president, welcomed him to the community and promptly listed a series of gentle reminders about aesthetic standards. His newly painted front door, a lovely shade of muted forest green, was apparently not within the approved color palette for lakeside dwellings. His choice of hardy, native wildflowers for the front garden was deemed insufficiently manicured for community standards. And his beloved, slightly weathered Adirondack chairs on the porch were not of the approved material or design for exterior furnishings. Daniel, initially, was bewildered. He had moved here for peace, not petty bureaucracy. He considered himself a considerate neighbor. He immediately chose a new, neutral paint color for the door, bought some uniform-looking shrubs to appease the manicured requirement, and even tucked his beloved Adirondack chairs around the side of the cabin, out of direct view. He wanted to make a good impression, to show he was willing to be part of the community, even if some of the rules seemed excessive. He even baked a batch of oatmeal cookies and delivered them to Brenda's front door, a peace offering. Brenda accepted them with a stiff, almost suspicious smile, mentioning something about how newcomers always need a little guidance. Daniel just wanted to belong, to live in harmony with his new surroundings and neighbors. He believed in kindness, in finding common ground, and he hoped his willingness to adapt would foster a friendly relationship. But Brenda Thorne, it soon became clear, had a different agenda. Her eyes, Daniel noticed, seemed to miss nothing. If he left a garden hose coiled on his lawn for a few hours, a polite, but firm, email would arrive, referencing obstruction of visual harmony. If he used a non-approved brand of fertilizer on his new lawn, a notice would appear, citing environmental contamination protocols. It was relentless, a constant, low-level hum of disapproval. Daniel, in his efforts to be empathetic, tried to see it from her perspective. Perhaps she was just very passionate about maintaining the community's appearance. Maybe she genuinely believed she was doing good. He'd wave, offer a friendly nod when he saw her walking her tiny, yappy terrier, Winston, down the road. He'd even stop to help old Mr. Henderson across the street fix a loose shingle on his roof, a gesture of neighborly goodwill that earned him a warm smile and a plate of homemade apple pie. Daniel believed in community, in looking out for one another. He hoped his actions would speak louder than any perceived rule infractions. One sunny afternoon, Daniel was happily tending his small vegetable patch, growing tomatoes and bell peppers, a hobby he'd picked up since moving to the cabin. He'd even offered some of his surplus cucumbers to his next-door neighbor, Clara, a kind woman who had lived in Whispering Pines for decades. She'd thanked him profusely, lamenting how the HOA, particularly Brenda, had made it difficult for anyone to express their individuality. "She likes everything to be just so," Clara had whispered conspiratorially, exactly like her house. As Daniel knelt, weeding around a budding tomato plant, he heard the distinctive click-clack of high heels on asphalt approaching his property. He looked up to see Brenda, flanked by another HOA board member, Carol Jenkins, a woman whose perpetually pursed lips suggested a permanent state of disapproval. Brenda's eyes immediately fixated on Daniel's small, inflatable kayak, which he had pulled up onto the grass near the lake's edge to dry after an early morning paddle. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice resonating with an exaggerated sigh, "we've received complaints." Again. Daniel straightened up, wiping a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "Complaints, Brenda? About my kayak?" He genuinely couldn't fathom the issue. It was small, neatly deflated, and sitting harmlessly on his own lawn. Section 4.1.c of the bylaws, Mr. Miller, Carol chimed in, her voice thin and reedy, as if reciting from a sacred text. "No personal watercraft shall be stored within 50 feet of the community lakefront access points, nor visible from shared thoroughfares, unless actively in use." "But this is my private property, Carol," Daniel explained, gesturing to his side yard, which led directly to his cabin and his lake access. "And it's drying. I just got off the lake." Brenda stepped forward, her posture rigid. "Private property or not, Mr. Miller, it is an eyesore. It detracts from the pristine aesthetic we strive for. And frankly, your continued disregard for these simple rules is becoming a pattern." She gestured vaguely towards the cabin. The unapproved garden gnomes, the non-standard mailbox, the excessive foliage by the waterline, it's all accumulating. Daniel felt a prickle of annoyance. He'd removed the gnomes, changed the mailbox, and only allowed native foliage to grow for ecological reasons. "Excessive foliage," he repeated, trying to keep his voice even. "That's natural growth, Brenda. And it's important for preventing erosion." Brenda scoffed. Erosion is handled by the association's designated landscape contractors, Mr. Miller. Not by your unkempt wilderness. This is a community, not a nature preserve. We have standards. High standards. She looked pointedly at his hands, still bearing traces of garden soil. And frankly, your overall presentation sometimes leaves much to be desired. You're not exactly upholding the image of a resident of Whispering Pines. Daniel took a deep breath. He tried to summon his usual empathy, but it was wearing thin. He simply wanted to enjoy his quiet life. He saw the judgmental glint in Brenda's eyes, the way she seemed to find fault in everything he did, not because it genuinely harmed anyone, but because it deviated from her rigid vision of perfection. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that her standards weren't about community harmony, but about control. About forcing everyone into her mold. We're sending you a formal warning, Mr. Miller, Brenda announced, pulling a pre-printed form from her clipboard. Another infraction, and we will be forced to levy a fine. A substantial one. She handed him the paper with a flourish, as if bestowing a royal decree. Consider this your final chance to align with the values of Whispering Pines. Daniel looked down at the warning, then back at Brenda and Carol, who stood side by side, their expressions a mirror of self-righteous authority. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He had tried to be the good neighbor, the understanding resident. He had yielded, compromised, and attempted to build bridges. But he understood now that some people didn't want bridges, they wanted absolute adherence. The next morning, a different kind of letter arrived in Daniel's mailbox. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a law firm he didn't recognize, with a return address in a distant city. He opened it, his brow furrowing. The letter was short, stern, and to the point. It stated that his cabin, his dock, and indeed, his very presence on the lakefront, constituted a trespass on common community property, and that all unauthorized structures, specifically mentioning his small, beloved dock, which he had spent weeks building and reinforcing, must be removed within 7 days. Furthermore, it threatened immediate legal action, including an injunction and the demand for significant damages, if he failed to comply. It explicitly named Brenda Thorne as the complainant, representing the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. This wasn't a fine. This wasn't a warning about gnomes or kayaks. This was an outright attack on his home, his peace, and his entire life by the lake. Daniel stared at the letter, his heart beginning to pound with a slow, heavy rhythm. He thought about the peace he had found here, the quiet mornings, the starry nights. He thought about Mrs. Vance's words, "It's more than just a house, it's a legacy." And then, a flicker of something new ignited within him, something beyond annoyance, beyond frustration. It was a cold, clear determination. He remembered those old, unique deeds, the ones Susan had mentioned, the ones his lawyer had skimmed. He needed to look closer, much closer. This time, he wouldn't just comply. He would fight. The legal letter felt like a physical blow, a sudden disruption to the quiet sanctuary Daniel had built. His initial reaction was a surge of disbelief, followed by a simmering anger. How could they claim he was trespassing? This was his land, his home. The old deeds, the ones Susan the real estate agent had talked about, suddenly became much more than just old papers. They became his shield, his weapon. He knew he hadn't paid enough attention to the archaic language, trusting his lawyer to handle the technicalities. Now, he regretted that oversight. He needed to understand every single faded word. Daniel pulled out the heavy, leather-bound folder from his filing cabinet. Inside, tucked away neatly, were the original property deeds, a thick stack of brittle parchment tied with a thin, faded ribbon. He carefully unrolled the top document. The script was beautiful, flowing, but difficult to read, full of wherefores and heretofores. He grabbed his laptop and began searching for old legal terms, cross-referencing phrases, piecing together the meaning of what he held in his hands. Hours passed. The sun set, casting long shadows across his living room, but Daniel barely noticed. He was lost in a different time, a different legal landscape. What he uncovered slowly, painstakingly, sent a shiver down his spine. The property wasn't just the small plot of land his cabin sat on. It was a vast, sprawling estate, much larger than anything he had imagined. The original land grant, dating back to the late 1700s, described a property that encompassed not just the direct shoreline around his cabin, but also a significant portion of the lake itself, extending to the deepest navigable channel. It also included what were called riparian rights, giving the owner exclusive use and control of the water adjacent to the property. More astonishingly, a specific clause detailed an ancient easement, a right-of-way granted to the original owners over a certain parcel of land that had, over centuries, been subdivided and developed. This easement, still valid, stretched deep inland, covering an area that, according to Daniel's careful mapping, included Brenda Thorne's own meticulously manicured backyard. His jaw dropped. He zoomed in on satellite maps, overlaid them with the descriptions from the deeds. There was no mistake. The lines drawn on the old parchments, when translated to modern coordinates, clearly showed his property extending out into the lake, encompassing not just his dock but also a good stretch of the water that the HOA now treated as community property. And the easement, that particular sliver of land, the very ground Brenda so proudly cultivated as her private sanctuary, was technically still part of his overarching historical property rights. It was a forgotten truth, buried under layers of time, subdivisions, and modern HOA bylaws that had simply never accounted for such ancient land grants. A wave of emotions washed over him, relief, disbelief, and a surge of protective instinct. This wasn't just about a kayak or a mailbox, it was about his home, his sanctuary, and a piece of history. He felt a profound connection to Mrs. Vance, to her ancestors who had carefully drawn these boundaries. He understood now why she had been so particular about who bought the land, why she had said it was a legacy. She knew. She had given him a silent gift, a powerful truth hidden in plain sight. The next morning, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a web designer who'd bought a cabin, he was the guardian of an ancient estate. He carefully compiled all his findings. High-resolution scans of the original deeds, printouts of the legal definitions, and his own meticulously drawn maps. He scheduled a meeting with his real estate lawyer, Mr. Davidson, a shrewd but kind man who had handled the initial purchase. Mr. Davidson's office was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to Daniel's rustic cabin. When Daniel laid out the historical documents, Mr. Davidson's usual calm demeanor shifted. His eyes, usually scanning documents quickly, lingered on the faded script. "These are remarkable, Daniel," he murmured, tracing a finger over a particularly ornate flourish. "True historical documents. Not many like these still fully intact and active." Daniel explained his findings, how the old land grant encompassed a large portion of the lake and the surprising reach of the ancient easement. He watched as Mr. Davidson's initial skepticism turned into focused concentration, then a slow, knowing nod. The lawyer pulled out his own property law textbooks, cross-referencing, verifying. "You're absolutely right, Daniel," Mr. Davidson finally stated, leaning back in his chair, a rare smile gracing his lips. "These deeds are rock solid. They predate the formation of this HOA, and any subsequent subdivisions or bylaws would have to respect these existing rights. It's a very rare case, but the language here is unambiguous. You, technically, own a significant portion of Whispering Pines Lake. And this easement, it's a right-of-way that still exists, giving you access and certain rights over that specific parcel of land. It means Mrs. Thorne's backyard, or at least a significant portion of it, falls within this historical easement." Daniel felt a quiet triumph. "So, they can't evict me?" Mr. Davidson chuckled. Evict you? Daniel, based on these documents, they can't even tell you where to park your kayak on your own lake. And as for the land Brenda calls her backyard, well, her property technically has a legal burden from your easement. It doesn't mean she doesn't own it, but you have significant, established rights over it. This changes everything. He paused, then added, this is quite the hand you've been dealt, Daniel. How do you want to play it? Daniel considered. He didn't want to be a tyrant. He hadn't bought the cabin to cause trouble, but to find peace. Yet, Brenda's continuous harassment, her attempts to control and intimidate him, had gone too far. He wasn't going to back down. I want to resolve this peacefully, if possible, Mr. Davidson. But I also want them to understand the truth. I want them to stop harassing me and other residents. He recalled Clara's quiet despair about Brenda's control. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for the spirit of a true community. Mr. Davidson nodded. Understood. We'll draft a formal response to their lawyer. We'll cite these deeds, lay out your rights, and demand they cease and desist from any further baseless claims or threats. It'll be polite, but firm. And very, very legally sound. He paused. You know, Daniel, sometimes the oldest truths are the most powerful. These old documents, they represent a different way of living, a different understanding of property. It's a shame people forget the spirit behind the law, focusing only on the rules. Daniel left the lawyer's office feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The weight of the HOA's threats had lifted, replaced by a quiet confidence. He still felt no malice towards Brenda, only a sense of weary resignation that she had forced his hand. He went straight home, the late afternoon sun illuminating his cabin in a warm glow. He walked down to his dock, the one Brenda wanted him to remove, and sat at its edge, dangling his feet in the cool lake water. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being told to remove a dock from a lake he, apparently, largely owned. He smiled. A few days later, the peace was shattered again, but this time, it wasn't a letter. It was a physical invasion. Daniel was inside his cabin, working on a new website design for a client, when he heard the rumble of heavy machinery. He looked out his window to see a small bulldozer and a crew of men in bright yellow vests on his property, just yards from his cabin. They were not from the HOA's approved landscaping company. They were heading directly towards his dock, towards the natural, dense brush he had intentionally cultivated near the waterline to prevent erosion. Brenda Thorne stood nearby, hands on her hips, her face a mask of smug satisfaction, directing the men with sweeping gestures. Carol Jenkins hovered at her side, nodding approvingly. "All right, gentlemen," Brenda called out, her voice carrying across the lawn. "First, that ghastly dock comes down. Then, clear out all this mess near the water. We need a clean, uniform shoreline." Daniel's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a threat anymore. This was active destruction. They were tearing down his property, violating his land, acting on the false premise of their legal letter without waiting for any response. His lawyer hadn't even had time to send his letter yet. This was a deliberate act of aggression, a complete disregard for due process or basic neighborly conduct. Daniel watched, his heart pounding, as one of the men climbed into the bulldozer, its engine roaring to life, its massive blade poised to rip through his peaceful shoreline. The roar of the bulldozer's engine filled Daniel's ears, a monstrous sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. He saw the gleam of the machine's massive blade, poised to tear into the very stretch of natural growth he had carefully cultivated to protect his shoreline, the growth Brenda had just minutes ago called a mess. This wasn't just an irritating letter or a warning, this was an active invasion, a demolition crew on his property, commanded by Brenda Thorne's smug, satisfied grin. His attempts at kindness, his efforts to be a good neighbor, had been met with outright aggression. The time for diplomacy was over. Adrenaline surged through Daniel. He burst out of his cabin, shouting, "Stop! What do you think you're doing?" The bulldozer operator, a burly man with a baseball cap pulled low, paused, looking startled. Brenda, however, didn't flinch. She turned to Daniel, her hands still on her hips, her smile widening into a triumphant sneer. "As I told you, Mr. Miller, you are in violation. We are simply enforcing the bylaws. This dock is unauthorized, and that bushy area is a hazard. The HOA has the right to maintain community property." She gestured grandly towards the lake. "We are reclaiming what is ours. This is my property." Daniel retorted, his voice rising, but remaining steady. He walked directly towards the bulldozer, ignoring Brenda's indignant huff. He pointed to the land, then to the lake. "Every inch of this, including the water you think you own, belongs to me. And so does the ground you're standing on right now, Brenda." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Don't be ridiculous, Mr. Miller. Your property ends at the water's edge, like everyone else's. And my backyard is mine. You're grasping at straws. Get back inside your cabin before I call the sheriff for trespassing." "Go ahead," Daniel challenged, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Because I'm calling them too. You are illegally demolishing my private property. This is criminal trespass and destruction of private property." He scrolled through his contacts, finding Mr. Davidson's number. "And I'm calling my lawyer. He has the historical deeds that prove every word I'm saying." Brenda scoffed, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with Carol, who looked visibly nervous. The bulldozer operator, sensing the sudden tension, wisely shut off his engine. The abrupt silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. "Deeds?" Brenda repeated, trying to sound dismissive, but her voice lacked its usual bite. "What nonsense are you spouting now? You bought a cabin, Mr. Miller, not the entire lake." "I bought more than a cabin, Brenda," Daniel stated, his voice calm, yet firm, now that he had regained his composure. "I bought a historical estate. An estate whose original land grant, from the late 1700s, clearly defines my ownership of a significant portion of this lake, all the way to its deepest channel. And it includes an ancient, active easement that runs across your property, right through what you call your backyard." He let that sink in, watching the color drain from Brenda's face. "So, yes, you are standing on my land, trying to tear down my dock, and claim my lake." The bulldozer operator, a man named Gary, who had been listening intently, slowly climbed down from his machine. "Look, ma'am," he said, addressing Brenda, "if there's a property dispute, we can't just start tearing things down. We need official boundary markers or a court order." He seems pretty confident. Brenda's composure was cracking. "He's bluffing, Gary. He's just a new homeowner trying to cause trouble. I am the HOA president, I know the rules." Her voice was shrill now, losing its authoritative edge. Just then, the wail of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as a sheriff's patrol car sped down the winding road towards Daniel's cabin. Daniel had called 911, reporting a property dispute and illegal demolition. The deputy, a young man named Officer Kelly, stepped out of his vehicle, his hand resting casually on his belt, surveying the scene, Daniel, the bulldozer, the bewildered crew, and the furious, red-faced Brenda and Carol. "All right, what's going on here?" Officer Kelly asked, his eyes moving from the bulldozer to Brenda, then to Daniel. Brenda immediately launched into a theatrical account, pointing accusingly at Daniel. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man, Mr. Miller, is resisting the lawful directives of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. He refuses to comply with our bylaws, and now he's threatening us, preventing our legitimate work to maintain community property. We are simply trying to remove an unauthorized structure and clear a hazardous area near the lake." Daniel held up his hand calmly. "Officer, that's not true. I'm Daniel Miller, the owner of this property. These people, led by Brenda Thorne here, have illegally brought a demolition crew onto my private land to destroy my dock and clear my shoreline. They are trespassing and attempting to destroy my private property. I have the deeds, ancient land grants, that clearly establish my ownership not only of this land but a significant portion of this lake, and even an easement that runs across what she claims is her private backyard." He then held up the legal letter he had received from Brenda, the one threatening him. "They sent me this, threatening legal action, and then, without waiting for any response, they decided to take matters into their own hands this morning." Officer Kelly's eyebrows went up. He looked at the letter, then at the bulldozer, then at Brenda, whose face was now a patchwork of defiance and growing panic. "Ancient deeds, Mr. Miller? Lake ownership?" He looked at Gary, the bulldozer operator. "And you were told to just start tearing things down without seeing any proof of ownership dispute?" Gary shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am here said it was HOA business, officer. Didn't think to question it when the president tells ya." Brenda tried to regain control. "Officer, he's making this up. No one owns a lake. This is nonsense. He's just trying to avoid his responsibilities as a homeowner." "Ma'am," Officer Kelly said, turning his attention fully to Brenda, "property disputes are civil matters, not something the HOA can just unilaterally resolve with a bulldozer. And if there are ancient deeds involved, that complicates things significantly. Mr. Miller, do you have these deeds here?" "I have copies, officer, and my lawyer has the originals and all the research." He was about to send a formal response to their attorney regarding their erroneous claims, Daniel explained. He pulled out the printouts of the deed excerpts and maps he had prepared. Officer Kelly took them, scanning them quickly. His expression grew serious. "This looks legitimate, ma'am. These aren't just modern property lines. This appears to be a historical land grant. If these claims hold up, you and your HOA could be in very serious legal trouble for property damage and trespass." He looked at Brenda, his voice firm. "I'm advising you to immediately instruct this crew to leave Mr. Miller's property. Do not touch anything else. This needs to be resolved through legal channels, not with heavy machinery." Brenda stood there, speechless for a moment, her usual imperious demeanor completely shattered. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Carol, sensing the tide had turned dramatically, subtly stepped back, trying to distance herself from the unfolding disaster. But the bylaws," Brenda finally stammered. "The bylaws do not supersede state law or established property rights based on historical land grants, ma'am," Officer Kelly stated plainly. "Your authority as HOA president does not extend to illegal demolition or trespassing. If you continue this, I will have to consider this a criminal matter, and I will be forced to place you under arrest for destruction of private property and trespass." He let that hang in the air, his gaze steady and unwavering. The threat of arrest seemed to finally pierce Brenda's bubble of self-importance. Her face, already red, turned a shade paler. She looked from Officer Kelly's stern face to Daniel's calm, resolute expression, then to the waiting bulldozer and the increasingly awkward crew. The fight had gone out of her. "All right," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "All right, Gary. Pack it up. Everyone out. Now." Her words were flat, devoid of their usual command. Gary, visibly relieved, immediately climbed back into the bulldozer, starting the engine, but this time, he steered it carefully, slowly, off Daniel's property, followed by the other crew members. Carol, without a word, scurried away, heading quickly towards the safety of her own home. Brenda stood frozen for a moment, defeated, glaring at Daniel with pure hatred, as if he had conjured the ancient deeds out of thin air just to spite her. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and marched stiffly back towards her own house, her once proud floral blouse now seeming to sag in defeat. The silence that followed their departure was profound, almost blissful. Daniel let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Officer Kelly handed back the deed printouts. "You seem to know your stuff, Mr. Miller," he said with a slight nod. "I'd still advise you to have your lawyer send that formal letter. Get everything on paper. But for now, you should be free of any more bulldozers." He paused, then added, "It's a beautiful spot you have here. Good to see someone looking after the natural side of it." With a final nod, Officer Kelly returned to his patrol car and drove away, leaving Daniel alone again with his quiet cabin, his undemolished dock, and the sparkling, undisputed lake that was now, more than ever, truly his. The immediate threat was gone, but Daniel knew this was far from over. Brenda Thorne might be defeated for now, but her glare had promised a deeper, more personal vendetta. He had exposed her public folly, humiliated her in front of her neighbors and her own hired crew. He had disrupted her carefully constructed world of control and petty rules. He had shown her she wasn't as powerful as she thought. And that, Daniel suspected, was something Brenda Thorne would never forgive. The quiet peace of the lake might be restored for now, but the undercurrents of resentment and the desire for revenge had just grown stronger. He had won the battle, but the war, he instinctively knew, had just begun, and the next skirmish might be even more personal and far-reaching. The days following the bulldozer incident were filled with a tense calm. The air around Whispering Pines Lake, usually so peaceful, felt thick with unspoken resentments, especially whenever Daniel saw Brenda. She no longer acknowledged him with even a stiff nod, her eyes would dart away, or she'd glare at him with an intensity that promised retribution. Neighbors, previously hesitant to speak out against Brenda, now cast Daniel curious glances, some even offering shy smiles or subtle waves. Word traveled fast in their small community, and the tale of the ancient deeds and Brenda's thwarted demolition attempt had spread like wildfire. Many residents, tired of Brenda's overbearing nature, felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, seeing her authority challenged for the first time. Daniel, meanwhile, settled back into his routine, but with a new layer of vigilance. His lawyer, Mr. Davidson, had promptly sent a comprehensive legal letter to the HOA's attorney. It outlined Daniel's historical property rights, attached copies of the relevant deed clauses, and unequivocally demanded a halt to all harassment, threats, and claims of trespass. The letter also highlighted the HOA's liability for potential property damage during the bulldozer incident. This legal response, formal and undeniable, was a powerful deterrent, forcing the HOA to back down from direct confrontation. For a while, things were surprisingly quiet. Daniel spent his mornings working on web designs, his afternoons enjoying the lake. He kayaked, fished, and continued to nurture his small garden. He even started a little project building a birdhouse, finding joy in the simple, creative act. He tried to ignore Brenda's piercing glares and the occasional hushed whispers he overheard about him being a troublemaker or not fitting in. He knew what he was doing was right, and that was all that mattered. One sunny afternoon, as Daniel was sanding a piece of wood for his birdhouse on his porch, his neighbor Clara walked over, a plate of fresh cookies in her hand. Clara was a gentle, older woman with kind eyes and a soft voice, who had lived in Whispering Pines for over 40 years. She rarely spoke ill of anyone, but her disapproval of Brenda had always been evident. "Daniel, dear," she began, her voice a gentle murmur, "these are for you. A little thank you for, well, for standing your ground." She handed him the plate, her eyes twinkling. "Brenda's been rather quiet lately, hasn't she?" Daniel smiled. "Thank you, Clara. They look delicious." "And yes, she has. Mr. Davidson's letter seemed to do the trick." Clara sighed softly. "It's a shame, really. This used to be such a lovely, peaceful place. Before Brenda took over the HOA, we all just lived our lives. Helped each other out. Now, it's all rules and fines. And she treats people so unkindly. Like that poor young family, the Wilsons, with their little boy, Leo. They just moved in down the street, and she's already hounding them about their lawn not being green enough. They're trying, but the boy has allergies, and they can't use all those harsh chemicals. Daniel frowned. He hadn't met the Wilsons yet, but the story saddened him. He believed in community support, not judgment. That's terrible, he said. Maybe I can offer to help them with some natural lawn care tips. I've been researching a lot for my own garden. Clara's face brightened. Oh, that would be wonderful, Daniel. They're lovely people, just trying to make a home. They could use a friendly face. A few days later, Daniel spotted Mrs. Wilson, a harried-looking woman named Sarah, struggling with a broken sprinkler head in her front yard. He walked over, offering a friendly smile. "Hi, I'm Daniel Miller, your neighbor from the cabin down the road. I couldn't help but notice you're having some trouble. Can I lend a hand?" Sarah looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and relief. "Oh, hello. Sarah Wilson. Yes, this thing is just refusing to cooperate. And honestly, with everything else, it's just one more thing." She gestured vaguely at her lawn, which had patches of brown mixed with green. "Brenda from the HOA has been sending us daily emails about the unacceptable state of our grass." Daniel nodded sympathetically. "I understand. I heard about Leo's allergies, too. Harsh chemicals aren't good for anyone, especially kids. I've been doing a lot of natural gardening here, and I actually figured out a pretty good way to revive a lawn without all the chemicals, just by improving the soil and using specific watering techniques." He knelt down, examining the sprinkler. "Looks like this just needs a new washer. I might even have one in my toolbox. Can I take a look?" Sarah's face lit up. "Oh, please, if you wouldn't mind. That would be a huge help." Daniel quickly fixed the sprinkler, then spent an hour with Sarah, sharing tips on natural lawn care, recommending organic fertilizers, and explaining how to properly aerate the soil. He even offered to lend them some of his tools. He spoke with genuine enthusiasm, his kindness radiating. Sarah was immensely grateful, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't experienced since moving into the community. "Thank you so much, Daniel," she said, truly touched. "You're a lifesaver. It's so nice to have a neighbor who actually cares." As Daniel walked back to his cabin, a genuine smile on his face, he felt a warmth spread through him. This was the community he had envisioned, one built on mutual respect and helping hands, not on arbitrary rules and petty complaints. He helped another neighbor, an elderly gentleman named George, fix a leaky faucet, and offered advice to a young couple, the Perezes, about building a raised garden bed for herbs. He wasn't trying to challenge Brenda, he was simply being himself, extending kindness, and showing empathy. His actions, small as they were, slowly began to chip away at the atmosphere of fear and tension that Brenda had cultivated. Residents started to see him not as a rule-breaker, but as a genuinely good person, someone who cared about the community's well-being. This growing camaraderie, however, did not go unnoticed by Brenda. She saw the friendly interactions, the subtle nods of appreciation directed at Daniel. She heard the whispers of gratitude from neighbors he had helped. It infuriated her. Her power, her carefully constructed authority, was built on fear and strict adherence to rules. Daniel's quiet acts of kindness, his very presence, challenged her control in a way no legal letter could. He was winning hearts, not just legal battles, and that was a threat she couldn't tolerate. She had been humiliated publicly, and now he was slowly, surely, usurping her perceived moral authority within the community. This was intolerable. She needed to reassert her dominance, and she needed to do it in a way that would leave no doubt about who truly held the reins in Whispering Pines. One afternoon, Daniel returned from a fishing trip, pulling his small boat ashore near his dock. He noticed a cluster of people gathered near the common area, a small park with a gazebo that served as the community's gathering spot. Brenda stood in the center, addressing a small, attentive crowd. Her voice, usually sharp, was now laced with an unusual solemnity, almost a manufactured sadness. As he got closer, he could make out her words, delivered with dramatic pauses. "And it deeply pains me," Brenda was saying, her hand pressed to her chest, "to inform you all of a grave development. Due to certain irregularities, certain actions by a new resident, actions that undermine the very foundation of our community's safety and environmental integrity, the HOA has been forced to make a very difficult decision." Daniel stopped, his boat half pulled from the water, a knot forming in his stomach. He saw Sarah Wilson and Clara in the crowd, their faces etched with concern. Brenda's eyes, suddenly meeting his from across the distance, glittered with malicious triumph. "Effective immediately," Brenda announced, her voice rising to a crescendo, "access to our beautiful Whispering Pines Lake will be severely restricted. The main boat launch will be closed indefinitely. Swimming will be prohibited, and all fishing permits are hereby revoked. Furthermore, due to the critical need for an environmental assessment, all waterfront properties, including docks and private lake access points, will be subject to immediate inspection, and any non-compliant structures will be removed at the owner's expense. This drastic measure, regrettable as it is necessary to protect our shared natural resources from potential harm." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Sarah Wilson looked horrified. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel stood frozen, his fishing rod still in hand. Brenda's gaze, fixed directly on him, was cold and triumphant. She hadn't just threatened him, she had found a way to hurt the entire community, punishing everyone to get at him, effectively taking away the very heart of why most people lived in Whispering Pines. The lake. And she had cleverly framed it as an environmental necessity, subtly implying that Daniel's irregularities were the cause. It was a vicious, calculated move, designed to turn the entire community against him. A stunned silence fell over the gathered residents, followed by a confused murmur that quickly escalated into a frustrated buzz. Brenda stood at the gazebo, basking in the shockwaves her announcement had created, her eyes still fixed on Daniel with a chilling satisfaction. The lake, the very heart of Whispering Pines, was being taken away, and she had effectively painted Daniel as the villain. It was a masterful, cruel stroke. Daniel, still gripping his fishing rod, felt a wave of anger, cold and sharp, wash over him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone. The Wilsons, who had just found solace in their new home, George who loved his morning swim, the Perezes who enjoyed lakeside picnics. Brenda was punishing an entire community for her personal vendetta, cloaking it in the guise of environmental protection. He knew, deep down, that her claims were baseless. His cabin was eco-friendly, his dock was meticulously maintained, and his shoreline growth was actually beneficial for the environment. This was pure malice. He strode towards the gazebo, his steps firm and determined. As he approached, whispers quieted, and all eyes turned to him. "Brenda," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the remaining hum, "what exactly are these irregularities you're talking about? What potential harm have I supposedly caused that warrants shutting down the entire lake for everyone?" Brenda turned to face him fully, her face a mask of false concern. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, "I don't appreciate being publicly challenged when I'm delivering difficult news. But since you insist. The HOA has received reports, credible reports, of unapproved structures, excessive and unmanaged foliage, and disturbing disruptions to the natural ecosystem around your property. These actions necessitate a comprehensive environmental assessment, and until it's complete, the lake must be closed for everyone's safety and the protection of the delicate ecosystem." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, allowing the crowd to connect the dots she was so carefully drawing. "It's regrettable, but sometimes one person's actions have consequences for all. A few murmurs of agreement rose from a small group of Brenda's staunchest allies, Carol among them. But the majority of the residents looked uneasy, their frustration growing. Sarah Wilson stepped forward, her voice hesitant. "But Brenda, our son Leo has severe allergies. We rely on the lake for safe, outdoor recreation. And our lawn, we've been trying so hard to get it green without chemicals, just like Daniel suggested. Is this really fair?" Brenda's smile tightened. "Mrs. Wilson, safety and environmental protection are paramount. Personal inconveniences, no matter how unfortunate, must take a back seat when the well-being of the entire community's natural resources is at stake. And as for lawn care, the HOA provides approved methods that do not involve unconventional practices." Her dismissive tone clearly indicated her disdain for Daniel's natural methods. "Unconventional?" Daniel interjected, stepping closer. "Brenda, my methods are environmentally friendly. And as for unapproved structures, my dock has been here for decades, and as my lawyer has already informed the HOA, the original deeds grant me explicit rights to the lakefront and its use. You can't just arbitrarily shut down access to a public waterway, or claim environmental damage without any actual proof, just to target one resident. This lake is not a public waterway, Mr. Miller." Brenda snapped, losing her composure slightly. "It is a private lake, owned and managed by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. And we have every right to protect it from your eccentricities." "That's where you're wrong, Brenda," Daniel said, his voice low and steady, radiating a quiet authority that silenced the crowd. He looked directly into her eyes, then slowly turned to face the stunned residents. "The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association does not own this lake." "I do." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Brenda's face went crimson, a mixture of shock and fury. Carol gasped audibly. "What utter nonsense!" Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking. "You are lying. You bought a cabin, Mr. Miller. Not an entire lake. This is defamation. You are trying to mislead these good people." "I have the deeds, Brenda," Daniel repeated, pulling out the same folded copies he had shown Officer Kelly. "Ancient land grants, going back to the 1700s, that explicitly state my property includes ownership of a significant portion of this lake, all the way to its deepest channel. My lawyer has already sent a formal letter to your HOA's attorney detailing this. The HOA's authority does not supersede these historical property rights. You have no legal basis to restrict lake access, to demand removal of my dock, or to claim environmental damage based on false premises." He then held up another document, a printout he'd hastily made before coming down to the gazebo. "And furthermore," Daniel continued, his voice resonating with conviction, "the HOA has no legal authority to inspect my private property without my consent or a valid court order. What you are doing, Brenda, is not only an abuse of your position but a direct attempt to punish innocent residents for your personal vendetta against me. There are no irregularities, there is no potential harm. You are simply using the community's love for this lake as a weapon to get at me, and that is not what a true community leader does." The crowd stared, wide-eyed, shifting their gaze from Daniel to Brenda, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Sarah Wilson exchanged a bewildered look with Clara. Old George, who had always been a quiet presence, slowly began to clap, a soft, deliberate sound that resonated in the stunned silence. Others tentatively joined him, a ripple of applause spreading through the small gathering. Brenda looked around, her eyes darting nervously from face to face. The applause, quiet at first, was growing louder, no longer supporting her, but supporting Daniel. She saw the betrayal in the eyes of her neighbors, the dawning realization of her manipulative tactics. Her power, built on fear and strict rules, was crumbling before her very eyes. She had pushed too far, overplayed her hand, and now her deception was laid bare. "This is outrageous!" Brenda finally shrieked, her voice desperate. You are all being misled by a troublemaker. This is a lie. A complete fabrication. She turned on Daniel, her fingers shaking as she pointed at him. You will regret this, Mr. Miller. You will regret trying to ruin this community. I will see to it that you leave Whispering Pines, one way or another. Her threat, however, lacked its usual punch. The residents had heard Daniel's calm, reasoned explanation, backed by what appeared to be genuine legal documents. They had seen Brenda's uncontrolled fury, her wild accusations. The contrast was stark. Kindness versus cruelty. Truth versus manipulation. Daniel simply looked at Brenda, his expression unyielding. I'm not trying to ruin this community, Brenda. I'm trying to save it from people like you, who use their positions to bully and control. I own this lake. And I will protect it, and this community, from anyone who tries to exploit it for their own selfish reasons. He then turned back to the residents, his voice softening, yet still strong. The lake is not closed. Your fishing permits are not revoked. Your access is not restricted. If Brenda Thorne or the HOA attempts to enforce these baseless claims, they will be breaking the law. And I will ensure they are held accountable. A wave of relief and gratitude washed over the faces of the residents. Sarah Wilson smiled, a genuine, happy smile. Clara beamed. Even George nodded approvingly. Brenda, seeing her carefully constructed plan utterly demolished, her authority openly defied and rejected, finally broke. She turned, stomping away from the gazebo, her shoulders hunched in defeat, Carol scurrying after her like a frightened shadow. The small crowd watched them go, then turned back to Daniel, a new respect dawning in their eyes. The peace had returned, but it was a different kind of peace now, one born not of apathy or fear, but of truth and quiet courage. Daniel had stood up not just for himself, but for the community, for the very essence of what made Whispering Pines special. The lake, shining under the afternoon sun, seemed to sparkle with a renewed vibrancy, reflecting the hope in the residents' eyes. But Daniel knew Brenda Thorne wouldn't simply disappear. Her last words, a venomous promise of regret, echoed in his mind. He had exposed her, humiliated her, and stripped away her power. This was not a woman who forgave easily. He had won the battle for the lake, but he sensed a deeper, more personal storm was brewing, one that would aim to strike at him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. Her next move, he was sure, would be far more insidious, and far more dangerous. He had to be ready. Brenda Thorne vanished from public view for a few days after her humiliating defeat at the gazebo. The Whispering Pines community, liberated from her oppressive rules, began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Residents cautiously reopened their lake access points, children splashed in the water, and the sound of laughter echoed across the shimmering surface once more. Daniel received numerous thank yous, heartfelt expressions of gratitude from neighbors like Clara, Sarah Wilson, and even taciturn old George. He felt a deep satisfaction, knowing his stand had brought genuine peace and happiness to his new home. He wasn't just a homeowner, he was a catalyst for positive change in the community. However, Daniel knew Brenda's silence was not surrender. He remembered her furious glare, her parting threat. Such a person, once exposed and humiliated, would not simply fade away. Her anger would fester, morphing into something more insidious, more personal. He spent extra time securing his cabin, installing new cameras, and keeping a watchful eye on any unusual activity. The peace was real, but it felt fragile, like the surface of the lake before a storm. The storm brewed quietly for a few weeks, almost imperceptibly. Then, strange things began to happen. Small, unsettling incidents that seemed minor on their own but, when pieced together, formed a disturbing pattern. Daniel's internet connection, usually reliable, started to experience intermittent outages, especially when he was working on important client projects. His outdoor lights, fitted with motion sensors, would inexplicably flicker on and off at odd hours of the night. Once, he found a dead fish, strangely placed, on his porch step. Another time, his mail, usually delivered promptly, went missing for days before reappearing, crumpled and slightly damp. These were not direct attacks, but subtle acts of psychological warfare, designed to annoy, to disrupt, to unnerve. He suspected Brenda, of course, but he had no proof. The incidents were too small, too easily dismissed as coincidences or minor technical glitches. He tried to ignore them, focusing on his work and his new friendships in the community. He continued to help neighbors, cementing his place as a trusted, kind presence. He taught Leo Wilson how to cast a fishing line, much to Sarah's delight. He helped Clara set up a compost bin, sharing his knowledge of organic gardening. These acts of connection felt like his best defense against Brenda's unseen machinations. Then, one crisp autumn morning, the unsettling incidents escalated dramatically. Daniel woke to a strange smell, a faint, acrid odor mixed with the scent of pine. He went to his kitchen to make coffee, and as he turned on the faucet, only a slow, brownish trickle emerged. The water pressure was almost non-existent, and the water itself was discolored. A wave of dread washed over him. He rushed outside to check his well, the primary source of water for his cabin. What he saw made his heart pound. The well pump, usually nestled securely in its housing, was exposed, its protective cover pried open. And nearby, he saw disturbed earth and the faint, unmistakable smell of something oily. Someone had tampered with his well. This was no longer just a nuisance. This was a serious act of sabotage, potentially endangering his health. He immediately called the local authorities, reporting the suspected tampering. The deputy who responded, not Officer Kelly but a more senior, gruff officer named Officer Thompson, took down the details. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. "Looks like someone poured something near your wellhead, Mr. Miller," Officer Thompson stated, pointing to a dark, greasy stain on the ground. "Hard to tell what without testing. This is serious. You shouldn't use this water until it's tested and cleared." Daniel's mind raced. He knew this was Brenda. This was her final, desperate move. She couldn't touch his land, so she attacked his very life source. It was a vicious, dangerous escalation. He nodded grimly. "I understand, officer. I have my suspicions about who might be behind this, but no concrete proof." He relayed the history with the HOA, the bulldozer incident, Brenda's threats. Officer Thompson listened patiently, jotting notes. "We'll investigate, Mr. Miller," Officer Thompson assured him. "But without direct evidence, it's hard to make an arrest. This kind of malicious mischief can be tough to pin down. Get your water tested immediately, and don't drink or use it for cooking." Daniel spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity. He arranged for a specialized well testing company to come out, and then he called a local plumber to assess the damage to his pump. He felt a profound sense of violation, a chill that went beyond the autumn air. This wasn't just about property lines or bylaws anymore, it was about safety, about peace of mind. He even had to buy bottled water, a jarring reminder of how his secluded haven had been invaded. That evening, as darkness fell, Daniel sat in his living room, illuminated only by the soft glow of his laptop. He was working on a temporary solution for his internet, trying to set up a mobile hotspot. The incident with the well, coupled with the previous minor acts of sabotage, hardened his resolve. He had tried to be patient, to be understanding, but Brenda had crossed a line. He needed concrete evidence, something undeniable that would finally expose her and hold her accountable. He reviewed the footage from his security cameras. They covered the perimeter of his property, but the well was in a blind spot, deliberately chosen for its seclusion. Still, he meticulously reviewed every frame from the past few days, looking for anything unusual. Hour after hour he watched, his eyes aching, until a flicker caught his attention on a different camera, one pointing towards the main road. It was late at night, in the early hours of the morning, just hours before he discovered the well tampering. A car, headlights off, pulling slowly down the road. It didn't look like any of his neighbors' vehicles. It stopped just past his driveway, slightly out of camera range, but its silhouette was visible. Then, a figure emerged, small and indistinct, slipping through the trees, staying close to the property line, moving with a furtive, almost creeping gait. The figure was wearing a dark, wide-brimmed hat, pulled low, and a bulky jacket, attempting to conceal their identity. They moved towards the direction of his well, disappearing into the shadows. A few minutes later, the figure reappeared, moving swiftly back towards the car, which then sped away, still with its lights off. Daniel paused the video. The figure was too obscured to identify clearly, but there was something familiar about their general build, the way they held themselves. He zoomed in, enhanced the contrast. It was still blurry, but he focused on the car. It was an older model, a specific make and color. He paused again, then pulled up a photo from his phone, a picture he'd taken a few weeks ago of a particular car parked near Brenda's house during a rare community gathering. It was Brenda's car. Not her everyday car, which was a shiny new SUV, but an older, less conspicuous sedan she sometimes used for quick errands, one he'd rarely seen out. This car, captured on his grainy security footage, was a near-perfect match for Brenda's older sedan. And the figure, though obscured, seemed to have Brenda's height and general frame. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a powerful lead. He had a vehicle, a time, and a strong suspect. He saved the footage, feeling a surge of grim determination. He knew Brenda was cunning, but she had underestimated his patience, his resolve, and his technological savvy. He also decided he wouldn't just go to the police with this. He would gather more, undeniable evidence. He would set a trap. The next evening, Daniel strategically placed a new, tiny camera, barely visible, hidden amongst the bushes near his well. It was a high-definition motion-activated camera, designed for wildlife observation, with infrared capabilities for night vision. He also bought a temporary security system with loud alarms and connected it to his phone. He wanted to catch her red-handed, to have irrefutable proof. He didn't want to just stop her, he wanted justice for everyone she had bullied. 2 nights later, just after midnight, Daniel's phone blared with an alarm. He sprang out of bed, heart racing, and checked his security app. The new camera near the well had been triggered. He watched the live feed, his breath catching in his throat. There she was. Brenda Thorne, clad in dark clothing and that same wide-brimmed hat, stealthily approaching his well. She carried a small, nondescript bottle. She knelt, fumbling with the well cover, attempting to pry it open again. As she struggled, the small, hidden camera, designed to capture every detail, recorded her face clearly as she turned slightly, muttering in frustration. There was no mistaking her. Her expression, caught in the infrared glow, was contorted with malicious intent. She was preparing to pour something else, perhaps more harmful, into his well. At that exact moment, Daniel, from the comfort of his cabin, remotely triggered the new security alarms he had installed. A piercing, ear-splitting siren erupted from multiple points around his property, shattering the night's silence. Simultaneously, bright floodlights, also remotely activated, blazed on, bathing Brenda in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Brenda shrieked, dropping the bottle. She scrambled back, terrified, her eyes wide with panic as the siren wailed and the lights blinded her. She stumbled backwards, tripping over a loose rock, and landed hard on the ground. She looked up, dazed, directly into the unblinking lens of the tiny, hidden camera, her face a perfect portrait of guilt and terror. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning the bottle, and sprinted away into the blinding light, disappearing into the darkness beyond the property line. Daniel watched the footage, his hands trembling, but not from fear. It was from a potent mix of anger and overwhelming vindication. He had her. Finally. He had the undeniable proof he needed. He had waited, he had been patient, and now, Brenda Thorne had walked right into her own trap. She had pushed him too far, risked his health, threatened his home, and thought she could get away with it. But Daniel Miller, the quiet web designer who owned an ancient lake, was not a man to be underestimated. The game was truly over, and this time, Brenda had not just lost, she had been unequivocally caught. The long nightmare of HOA Karen was finally at an end.